Good evening, St. Peter's. I'm Father Perry Mullins. I'm coming to you from my back patio this evening with a class that I'm really excited about. We're calling this the Anglican Way, and we're talking through some of the beliefs of our church in comparison with other churches that are similar and different to us, and then sort of looking at those beliefs through the lens of history and seeing how they've changed and transformed. I know that all sounds really heady and bookish, but this is going to be a really fun thing. You have on the call three very different perspectives. Do y'all want to say hello?
Hello, I'm Father Lorenzo, and as most of you know, and I'm really glad to be here and to be a part of the conversation.
I'm Mother Kathy, and I am also excited for this conversation between your three priests here.
So we're going to jump in this evening talking about Anglican polity. We'll talk about what that means in just a second. And then next week, we're going to talk about Anglican views on baptism and confirmation. The week after that, we'll talk about Anglican views on the Eucharist. Did I miss one in there?
No, that's right. Oh, I thought maybe the second week would be on worship.
Yeah, that's right. So next week, we'll talk about Anglican worship. Week 3, we'll talk about Anglican views on baptism and confirmation. Week 4, we'll talk about Eucharistic theology, what we believe about communion. And then the 5th week is going to be an open Q&A. So we'll have everyone on the call with us that evening, and you get to lob some questions at us and see what comes out. So it'll be a lot of fun. But we want to start talking about Anglican polity because I think it sets the stage for the rest of it. Polity really just means who we are and what we do and the rules that we agree to live under and the structure of our church. Polity comes from an ancient Greek word that actually means citizenship. And so it's sort of the rules that we all agree to in order to live in common, to be citizens together, if you think about it that way. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that is for us. But I want to first talk about some other Christian polities out there that I think y'all will know pretty well. Father Lorenzo, do you want to tell us a little bit about Roman Catholic polity? How is the Roman Catholic Church structured?
So the Roman Catholic Church, like the Anglican Church, has an Episcopal polity, meaning it has bishops, but it also has a papal polity. So the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, is seen by the Roman Catholic Church to be the vicar of Christ. So a vicar is someone who reigns when the truly reigning king is absent. So the vicar is there in his absence. And so what that means is...
Do y'all know where that word comes from? I love the word vicar. You hear that used some in our tradition too, for like mission churches. The word vicar is used for like the priest in charge, and it's the same root as the word vicarious. So like the vicar in a mission church is vicariously acting as the bishop, who's really the one leading that church. In larger churches and in parishes that are self-sustaining, it's not a vicar, it's a rector, and there's a little bit of a difference there, but that's probably splitting hairs. In really large churches, sometimes you'll also see a rector and then a vicar under the rector, who's managing a lot of the day-to-day and is sort of acting like the rector. Mother Kathy has honestly been that here at St. Peter's. She's able to handle all of the ins and outs of parish life and run with things like a rector would, which has been awesome for me. So that's kind of where vicar comes from and how we're using it and why the Roman Catholic Church uses that in the way that they do.
Yes, so the Pope is, as you said, he's vicariously running the church, as they believe. So he's the vicar of Christ and the successor of St. Peter. And he is thought to be the universal head over the entire church. He has universal jurisdiction over all Christian bishops, and that he is able to ordain or depose anyone he wants, and that he really sort of, when you look at some of the papal documents that, I mean, and you see this especially in the First Vatican Council in like 1870, there's very strong language about who the Pope is and what he can do, that he has in his person full, immediate jurisdiction over all bishops and all the Christian faithful, and that he is the head of the church. And so all of the church is seen as sort of flowing down from the bishop, and he is not just like first among equals, or like he sort of is equal with all the other bishops. He is the head of and has jurisdiction over all the bishops and the faithful. That's the Roman Catholic view. And their ecclesiology, or their theology of the church, sort of comes out of that polity.
So an interesting note there, Father Lorenzo mentioned, right, 1870 is a big moment, right? That's the moment that they talk about papal infallibility. But that comes after really centuries of schism, right? So the 1500s, 1600s, you have the Reformation hitting really hard. Back to, let's see,
1054.
50, I was going to say 56. It's good that we have someone here who's just taken his canonical exams.
That's right. Yeah, I got to know all these facts.
1054 is the Great Schism. So that's the Eastern and Western churches splitting. But even further back, I mean, the history of schism in the church goes all the way back to the beginning. And so you see in that a development that's always, for the Roman Catholic Church, included some element of Roman supremacy, but really develops and hits strong in the 1800s after the Reformation, and when those Reformed churches are starting to take off. There's almost a threat scene there, so that gets set in stone a little bit more at that point. But it goes all the way back into like scriptural times. In the book of Acts, you see Peter having some sense of supremacy there. Ignatius of Antioch talks about Rome being, I forget the term he uses, it's fantastic, but something about Rome being primary among the churches or something like that.
Yeah, primus inter pares, the first among equals.
He actually doesn't use that term.
Oh, no, it's not that.
First among equals comes out more later. He calls it something else, and I don't remember what right now, unfortunately.
Those who are curious enough can look it up on their own.
That's right.
But you're right, Father Perry. This goes back a long way before the modern era, and this was one of the reasons why the Great Schism happened, because the Roman Catholic Church claimed that the Pope had universal jurisdiction over all the bishops, and the Eastern Orthodox, the Greek, the Russian, the Ukrainian, all of these churches in the eastern half of the empire, they did not believe that. They did not believe that the bishop had universal jurisdiction over all of them, and that was one of the principal reasons for the Great Schism between East and West.
So it's probably important here to say something about the polity in the early church as well. In the earliest church, the polity was, I mean, I like to think that the polity in the early church was similar to what we've developed in Anglicanism today, but that's me looking at this with rose-colored glasses, because this is the tradition I've chosen, and I acknowledge that. Every church has in its polity something that they've carried on from the early church. But in the early church, you see churches developing around cities, around metropolitan areas, and you see a bishop in that city running every church, and when they come together, it's less forced and more because they know they need to. They don't have all the structure that we have in it today, where there are, they had councils, they had meetings, it was just a different world. Less communication, obviously, went into that, but it was a lot more local. I guess that's what I'm getting at. And you see very early on that development from local towards something centralized, and the central location very quickly becomes Rome. But before that, there was something much more local. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, you see that local polity lived out still. So very much like in the early church, every metropolitan archbishop is responsible for his see, and they come together not because they have to, but because they want to. And it doesn't always work well. I'll admit that they don't always get along, right? I don't want to look at that with rose-colored glasses either, but there is some beauty to it.
There's more collegiality there.
Perhaps, yeah. So through the ages, right, this develops even further. In the Reformation, something else happens, and we eventually get to almost a more congregational polity. Mother Kathy, do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah. I grew up an Episcopalian, a cradle Episcopalian, and when I finally learned a little more about other denominations was when I was in seminary. Obviously, there was the academic part of that, but there was also the practical side of that, and that I went to seminary with students from many, many different denominations. And I was so confused at first when we would talk about our ordination process and how different that looked for me as an Episcopalian compared to, for an example, a friend of mine who came from the Congregational church. In the Congregational church, much is decided within the congregation itself. There isn't a hierarchy with a bishop. So for me, when I wanted to go to seminary, I had to go to my rector, be approved by the vestry, go to the diocese, to the bishop, committee 1, committee 2, all kinds of committees that were working on behalf of the bishop. Friends of mine in the Congregational church simply talked to the councils at their own church and went off to seminary really without any structure whatsoever. And the difference at the end that came out was it was really hard for some of them to even then find a placement, because they kind of said that they had a call and they were going to go to seminary, but they didn't have this whole, I wouldn't have called it a support system at the time because it didn't feel that way, but this whole structure of support leading them through discernment, it was much more individualistic than it was in my experience. And what I came to learn out of all of that is that we are hierarchical, we are led by a bishop, and there's a great appreciation for that leadership that we have. It counterbalances what an individual might think on their own. It provides a counterbalance to that.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, so go ahead.
In every New England town, on every green, there's an Episcopal church on one side of the green and a Congregational church on the other side of the green, with those two different polities in every town.
Mm.
Yeah. So, in practical terms today, right, that congregational polity includes, all the big non-denominational churches that you see. Pretty much they're going to be Congregationalists. They operate, within their congregation, and without a greater hierarchy. A lot of Baptist churches operate very much like congregational churches as well.
They do. I had a friend who was pursuing, or it isn't even right to say he was pursuing ordination. It wasn't a process, but he told me he was going to be a pastor. I said, "Oh, you're going to seminary?" And he said, "No." I'm like, "Well, wait a minute." He said, "No, my church has decided I should be a pastor, and I'm going. So they're making me the pastor."
Yeah. Yeah. So you can see a lot of things in a congregational polity that might look strange in ours. I have a group of pastors here in McKinney that I have lunch with from time to time, from all different denominations, other Episcopalians, Roman Catholics, down to congregational non-denoms. And one of the things that I've always found really interesting is in a non-denominational church, in a congregationalist polity, the pastor has less protections when preaching also. So I've heard pastors talk about how nervous they are to talk about, big, scary topics that might be hard for their congregations to hear because their job's on the line, right? If the congregation doesn't like their preaching or the message that they have, even if it's the gospel, they can be let go for that. In a church with a little bit more structure in their polity, there are some protections for that, which is good.
Yeah, I'll say.
I've seen that happen a few times where in a congregational church, the pastor is simply voted out, and that's the end of the relationship with the church.
Right. Having a bishop, having a diocese is a really nice way to offer some of those protections to everyone, right? Someone to step in when a pastor oversteps, and someone to step in when a pastor is, for instance, preaching the gospel and the congregation doesn't like it very much. So having that structure, for Anglicans is important to us because it provides something in the middle. Middle way is a term that gets thrown around in Anglicanism a lot, a via media. And our polity very much is a via media between a Roman Catholic polity and something that's a little bit more congregationalist. I'm really sorry, it's getting really dark. I did not think this through. I'm sitting on my patio here. I put a light out to help with that. I'm going to sit somewhere else next week when we do this. But bear with me, and I hope I don't look like a ghost. I hope this doesn't look like I'm telling horror stories by a campfire, right?
So for us, we have a vestry,
right?
Like in the congregational church.
Right.
Yeah, we also have a bishop, so that is the middle way.
And there are certain responsibilities given to a vestry, certain responsibilities given to a pastor, and certain responsibilities held by the bishop to help keep all those things in tension.
Well, and in the Episcopal Church, it makes sense because the same people who framed our government in the United States with all its checks and balances also framed our polity here in the United States.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's an interesting note. Some of you know the story, right? That the Constitutional Congress happened, and then after it was over, everyone went down the street and into the church and essentially wrote the Constitution and canons of the Episcopal Church, which is very true. It really did happen a few weeks apart. And in the same city, and had a lot of the same people involved. So the Episcopal Church is actually set up really different than you see a lot of Anglicanism. And it's because of all the things that were happening right as our church set up. So Father Lorenzo, do you want to say a few words about how most Anglican provinces are organized?
Sure. So you've got, the Church of England is the mother church of the Anglican Communion, and that one has the most distinctive because the monarch is involved in the actual administration of the church. Henry declared himself the supreme head of the church. Then Queen Elizabeth called herself supreme governor, which I think maybe she thought that Christ should be the supreme head and she'll just be the supreme governor. But even today in the Church of England, the monarch still appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury, and still is a part of it really is the supreme governor of the Church of England. That's because of the way that the Church of England formed in that country. In most other provinces of the Anglican, well, in fact, in all other provinces of the Anglican Communion, that's not the case. You have an archbishop, or in the Episcopal Church, you have a presiding bishop. And that is
But there's a difference between those.
Yes, there is. So an archbishop,
say something about that, yeah.
So an archbishop is arch over the other bishops, whereas a presiding bishop is that same word again, the first among equals. So the presiding bishop isn't on a higher level than the other bishops, but has other duties.
Mother Kathy, you served and lived in England for a little while. How are bishops appointed in England versus how bishops are appointed here?
I actually didn't serve in England. I was having babies in England, so I did not.
You lived in England. Oh, okay.
Did not serve in the church there.
If I remember this right, and I'm not 100% on this, but if I remember this right, the Archbishop just appoints bishops in England. They're no one's getting together and voting or anything like that the way we have here. So it's a little bit different there. Here, bishops are appointed by it's actually a really intense process. So there's a convention within a diocese to appoint a bishop, and the convention has to elect, I believe by supermajority, within the lay order and the clergy order. And then once that's done, and you have someone elected, that has to go to all of the bishops of the Episcopal Church and all of the standing committees of the diocese of the Episcopal Church to give consent.
It's very democratic.
It's very democratic and very intense.
Not appointments, yeah.
A diocese can elect a bishop in the United States and that bishop not be confirmed, and therefore they have to start over again, right? Mm-hmm. So even an election within a diocese doesn't mean you have a bishop. Whereas in England, in most of the Anglican provinces, you have an archbishop appointing. Mm-hmm. I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to find a spot with some more light. Give me 1 second. All right. I am sorry about that, guys. I had this great idea that I was going to sit on the patio and it was going to be really lovely, and turns out it was really dark. So I didn't know whether
to say anything. I thought, well, maybe I should text him. I don't want to do the chat feature. Like, I cannot see your face. I
could see it. So I turned my flashlight on my phone and set that up, pointed at me. It didn't work, right? So this is the beauty of Zoom. You have all experienced something like that in recent weeks. So to jump back in, right, we've been talking about the polity in the Episcopal Church, the polity in the Anglican Communion. What does our ordained leadership look like? Mother Kathy, you're on the Commission on Ministry. Maybe you have thoughts on that.
I am on the Commission on Ministry. So this is something that comes up for us a lot, particularly when people feel called to ordination, but we're looking at, well, ordained to the diaconate or ordained to the priesthood. And that's something that we try to guide them through in that discernment process. The difference between the priesthood and the diaconate and is that although all priests have a strong call to serve those in need, that is the particular call for the diaconate. And all priests, we are ordained as deacons first, and that's to really acknowledge and own our call to serve as well. When Father Perry, Father Lorenzo, and I were ordained to the priesthood, we didn't lose that call to serve those in need, but the call changed in that in the priesthood, we are also called to proclaim the gospel. We're called to preside at the Eucharist. We are called to baptize. We are called to care for the people within our congregation. A little difference with the diaconate is we say that the deacons are called to let the church, make the church aware of the needs of the community and to bring those to us. When we think of our own Deacon Betty, and her years of nursing, she has a particular diaconal call that involves serving those who are sick, and she makes the church aware of the needs of those people so that we can gather as a community with them. So those are some of the basic differences between the call to the priesthood and the call to the diaconate. And of course, we've already been talking about another order of ordained ministry, and that's the bishop. Now, the bishop, of course, also has a call to serve those in need, and also has a call to preside at the Eucharist, to baptize, also confirm. But the bishop also has a sacred duty to protect the doctrine of the church, to make sure that we have clear teaching on the gospel, that we don't go off into heretical positions. And the bishop also has a call to be part of the councils of the church. The priests do as well, but it's much broader. Our bishop, Bishop Sumner, has a call to participate in the church's councils in the world. And our bishop in particular plays a great role in that.
Yeah. If Lambeth Council were happening this year, and it should be, but is not, our bishop is actually one of a handful on the planning group for Lambeth Council. Lambeth is something that happens traditionally every 10 years, and it's a gathering of all of the bishops in the Anglican Communion. So not just the primates, not just the archbishops, presiding bishops, not just kind of the top tier, but every bishop in the Anglican Communion gathering together. I think they actually gather in Canterbury, not at Lambeth Palace. Is that right? Maybe they gather at Lambeth Palace. I have no idea. The Archbishop of Canterbury actually resides at Lambeth Palace in London. So there's kind of a difference there. Those are a couple of hours apart from each other. But Lambeth Conference, nonetheless, is a really amazing time to see our church come together in a beautiful way. Father Lorenzo, anything to add on orders?
Well, I would want to talk a little bit about sort of the history of those three orders as we see it in the New Testament and the early church. So when we look at the Acts of the Apostles and the pastoral epistles, that's 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. When we look at that, we get sort of glimpses of what the early church's polity or church government looked like. And we do see these three terms. We have diakonoi, or deacons, and they did have the same sort of role of servanthood. That's what deacon means. It means servant. Servanthood and ministry among the poor and those who are needy. And that's why they are, I mean, it's in Acts 6, I believe, and they come together and they say, you know, we're busy preaching the word of God, and there's this dispute about the financial the contributions for some of the widows in the community. And so some of the apostles say, you know, we're really busy preaching the word, and we can't really look after this the way it deserves to be looked after. So appoint 6 men who can really take care of this need of the community, and that's the deacons. And then we have another term, which is presbyteros, which means elder. And so it's an ordained elder, someone who preaches the word and who has a sort of presiding function in a Christian congregation. And then the third one is episkopos, from which we get episcopal, bishop or overseer. That's literally what it means, overseer. And there's some debate historically about whether or not presbyter and bishop were really just like the same office, but 2 different names for the same office, or if they really were 2 different offices. But they did eventually become different offices, at least in the 300s or so. They may have been originally the same, but those are those 3: presbyter, bishop, deacon, and that's what we call the threefold ministry, which the Anglican Communion upholds to this day.
The way I view that, and to kind of put it in order, is that the bishops were the first, right? So you get in the Gospels even, Jesus sending out the apostles. The word apostle, as opposed to disciple. Disciple means one who follows. Apostle means one who is sent. So the apostles they're sent out. I mean, the 12 disciples are sent out and become apostles. That's very much the way that we think about bishops. And after the ascension, after the day of Pentecost, the apostles were sent out by the Spirit and planted churches all around. Right? You hear about St. Thomas planting churches in India. You hear about St. Peter really going to a number of places. St. James in Jerusalem. All of the apostles went out and planted communities of faithful worshipers. So in a sense, the bishop is the first order out there, and the deacon is actually the second. So very early on in the book of Acts, you have that interaction that you talked about a second ago, where there's a need for something else. And so the community gathers those 6, the bishop lays hands on them and sends them out ordered with their lives ordered in a different way to do that ministry. As the church grows, every church community doesn't have a bishop anymore, doesn't have one of these people who is sent out anymore. And very often those who are sent out plant the churches and then sort of leave someone in charge and go off and plant another church. You hear about Paul talk about that a lot in the epistles. And so presbyter, priest, is kind of the third order that is very much doing the work of the apostle, but in a more local sense. So the bishop is doing the same work, but in a broader sense, in a more worldwide sense, and that ties us together and bonds us together and keeps us unified as a church. Whereas the presbyter is doing the same work, but within a community. So they're all leadership at different levels, if that makes sense, different orders. But I at least subscribe to the order that it went. Bishop and deacon and priest came a little ways down the line, but very much came out of the bishop's order. Anything else to Mother Kathy?
As we talk about these orders, where do lay people come in?
Yeah, I mean, lay people really are the first, right?
Right.
Lay people
right.
are the disciples who, before anyone was ever sent out, They're the crowds of people that are following Jesus. For me, that honestly is the highest calling that I have, right? If tomorrow the bishop called me up and said, Perry, you don't get to be a priest anymore, I would still be a disciple. I would still be a follower of Christ. I think that Mother Kathy, you brought this up, right? That every time you are ordered anew, you carry the previous order with you. It's not something that you leave behind, right? So like we are all still, the three of us, confirmed lay people. I mean, confirmed disciples, right? And we are all, the three of us, deacons. And we are all, the three of us, priests.
And baptized. That's the beginning
That's
of everything.
it.
That's
the
the beginning, yeah.
Then confirmation, then ordination.
Yeah.
So it's, I mean, that really is, because the baptism, and this is what they call total ministry, or really it's the baptismal theology of the 79 prayer book. It's really that baptism is the foundation for all other Christian ministry, and that ordained ministry is only a subset of baptismal ministry. That's why we don't typically, like on some other churches may call, like, oh, the minister, right? In other words, the pastor. And we can say ordained minister, but we don't want to say, oh, the priest is the minister. All baptized Christians are called to be ministers, to minister, to do ministry. But the ordained ministry is a specific way of living out that baptismal identity.
Okay.
That was,
I'm
sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that was brought home for me when I began the ordination process, because the first person I met in the process to be interviewed by was the priest who baptized me. So it was a continuation of that baptism.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot that we didn't talk about tonight. Why we use the term priest, for instance, why we use a lot of the terms that we use, to be honest. We didn't talk through all of the different polities out there that kind of brought us to where we are, but I hope at least you see that there's sort of a continuum. There's a spectrum out there in polity, where you have this a polity that's very top down, that is very you have this idea of papal supremacy on one side. You have something on the other side that's very congregationalist. Every congregation is on their own, and we fall somewhere in the middle of that, and not because we didn't like either option and so we settled for something else. I think the via media gets thrown around like that a lot, right? We just kind of pick the middle ground, maybe because the Anglicans don't like a fight. I don't know, right? But it's actually, I think it's a really conscious decision. We believe in a local polity, like there was in the early church. We believe that the context is different in all different locales, and it's important to do ministry in your context and with your people, and not to be governed by something that is so far removed from you that it doesn't fit anymore. But we also heartily believe that we have to be unified in this. If we're not Catholic, right? Little c Catholic. We don't have those bonds that tie us together. And if we're not that, we're kind of lost. So Anglicanism has found a way to be unified without necessarily having a top-down structure, and while really embracing different localities, different cultures, different expressions of faith throughout that. And it's a beautiful, wonderful thing. And that is one of the reasons that I have followed the Anglican way. Next week, we will talk about worship in the Anglican Communion in the Episcopal Church. That's going to be a fun one. There's going to be some banter here. I can promise you that.
Yeah, this one and the one on the Eucharist, we're gonna get some back and forth.
Yep,
I think between me and you.
They're going to be fun. I think between all of us, I think I'm going to get ganged up on if I'm being honest. But it's going to be awesome. I'm excited. So we're talking about worship next week. So join us for that. All the ins and outs of worship, the ritual, the prayer book, why we do what we do, and where it came from. So join us for that. And I just want to say, from all of the clergy, from Deacon Janice and Deacon Betty as well, we miss you all right now. We can't wait to be back together again when the time is right, and we are praying for you through this. We love you, St. Peter's, and we'll see you next week.
See y'all soon.